My name is Thomas Reyes, and I am 74 years old. I spent 38 years with the fire department in Portland, Oregon. 31 of those years as a firefighter, and the last 7 as a captain, before I finally hung up my turnout gear for good. I want to tell you about the worst sentence anyone has ever said to me, and about the Saturday morning 3 weeks later, when 200 firefighters stood in a banquet hall and proved, without a single word directed at my son, exactly how wrong he'd been. It happened on a Tuesday evening in April, at my son Ryan's new house. He'd just closed on his first home, a modest 3-bedroom in Beaverton, and he'd asked me to come help him move a few heavy pieces of furniture, a dresser his mother-in-law had given him, an old roll-top desk he'd inherited from his father-in-law, that kind of thing. I was happy to go. I'll tell you honestly, moments like that had become rarer between Ryan and me over the years than I ever expected they would when he was small, and I took whatever chances came my way to be useful to him, to be present in whatever small way he'd allow. We got the dresser up the stairs fine. The roll-top desk was another matter, heavier than either of us expected, awkward through the narrow hallway turn, and about halfway through wrestling it around that corner, I felt something pull wrong in my lower back. An old injury from a roof collapse in 1998 that had never fully healed right, and I had to set my end down and step back for a moment. I want to describe that house to you for a second, because I remember it so clearly even now. It smelled like fresh paint and new carpet, the particular smell of a life just beginning. Moving boxes still stacked 3 deep in the living room. A crib not yet assembled in the room that would become the nursery, since Sarah was 4 months pregnant at the time. A fact that made the whole afternoon feel weighted with a kind of hope I hadn't expected to feel that day. I remember thinking, standing in that unfinished hallway with my back aching, that I was about to become a grandfather, and that some part of me wanted desperately to get this one right, in a way I wasn't entirely sure I'd gotten right the first time around. Ryan's frustration came out sideways, the way frustration often does between people who are actually angry about something much older than the thing in front of them. "Great, Dad. Perfect timing," he said, not looking at me, both hands braced against the desk. "Just like always." I asked him what he meant by that, and I wish now I hadn't, because I think some part of him had been waiting a long time for permission to say what came next. You know exactly what I mean. You show up, and then the second something actually gets hard, you're checked out. That's the story of my whole childhood, Dad. You were never actually there. Not for my games, not for my graduation, not for Mom when she needed you. You were always at the station, always on some call, always some other family's emergency mattering more than ours. His voice was rising now, and his wife, Sarah, had come to the top of the stairs, and I remember the look on her face, caught between wanting to intervene and understanding this had been building for years, long before she'd ever met either of us. "You want to know something, Dad? You were never anyone important. Not to us. You spent 38 years telling yourself you were some kind of hero, and the whole time, your own family barely knew you." The hallway went very quiet after that. I remember the particular quality of the silence, the kind where you can hear your own pulse in your ears, the kind where a sentence hangs in the air long after the sound of it has actually stopped. I want to be honest with you about what I felt in that moment, because I think honesty is the only thing that makes a story like this worth telling. My first feeling wasn't anger. It was something closer to a very old, very deep kind of grief. The recognition of a fear I'd carried quietly for almost 4 decades, finally being spoken out loud by the one person whose opinion of me had always mattered more than any commendation or medal the department ever gave me. Every parent who has ever missed a recital for a work obligation, every firefighter's kid who has ever grown up watching an empty chair at the dinner table more nights than they'd like, carries some version of that fear inside them, wondering if the sacrifice actually meant anything to the people it was supposedly protecting. I didn't argue with him. I want you to understand that clearly, because I think the instinct to defend yourself in a moment like that is almost overwhelming, and I felt it, believe me. 38 years of specific memories rising up in me all at once, wanting to be recited like evidence in a trial. But I looked at my son's face, red with an anger that I understood, underneath everything, was really just old hurt, wearing a grown man's voice, and I said only this: "I'm sorry you feel that way, Ryan. I never wanted that for you." And then I helped him finish getting the desk into the room, my back aching the whole time, and I drove home in silence. And when I got there, I sat in my truck in the driveway for a long time before I could make myself go inside. I want to tell you what that drive home was like, because I think it matters. 30 minutes on the 26, and I spent every one of them running through a lifetime's worth of memories, the way I suppose any father would after hearing a sentence like that from his own son. I thought about Ryan's Little League games, the ones I made and the ones I didn't. I thought about his high school graduation, which I had missed, genuinely missed, not through negligence but because a warehouse fire off Powell Boulevard had claimed 2 lives that same afternoon, and I'd spent his graduation ceremony instead standing in the wreckage of a building trying to help investigators understand what had gone wrong. Coming home well past midnight to find Margaret, my wife, asleep on the couch with Ryan's cap and gown folded neatly on the coffee table, a silent reproach I never quite recovered from, even though she never said an unkind word about it. I thought about all the ordinary Tuesday evenings I'd missed too, not just the dramatic ones, the countless dinners where my chair sat empty because I was working a 24-hour shift, the parent-teacher conferences Margaret attended alone, the small accumulating weight of a childhood spent with a father who was, more often than either of us wanted, simply somewhere else. By the time I pulled into my own driveway, I understood something I hadn't fully let myself understand before that night, that Ryan wasn't wrong about the facts. He really had grown up with an absent father, more often than either of us would have chosen if the choice had been entirely mine to make. Where I believed he was wrong, where it took me those 3 weeks in that ballroom to find the words to tell him, was in what that absence had actually meant. Let me tell you a little about those 38 years, because I think you deserve to understand what Ryan didn't fully see growing up, and what I never adequately explained to him, maybe because some part of me believed a man shouldn't need to explain himself to his own children, that the work should speak for itself. I've come to believe that was one of my greatest failures as a father, the belief that showing up in silence for other people's emergencies was enough, without ever sitting my own son down and telling him, in plain words, why it mattered, and what it cost me too. I joined the Portland Fire Bureau in 1988, 22 years old, 6 months out of the academy, assigned to Station 21 in a rough stretch of the city that saw more structure fires in a bad winter than some stations saw in 5 years combined. I want to tell you about one particular night, March of 1994, because it's the night that I think, more than any other, explains who I became and what it cost the people who loved me. There was a 4-story apartment building on Northeast Alberta Street, mixed residential, mostly immigrant families, many of them without much English, packed tighter into those units than the building code ever intended. Electrical fire started in a 3rd-floor unit around 2 in the morning, spread fast through old lath and plaster walls that hadn't seen an inspection in years. By the time we arrived, flames were already through the roofline on the north side, and we had confirmed reports of people trapped on the 4th floor, a young mother and her 3 children, the oldest maybe 9 years old, cut off from the main stairwell by fire that had already claimed the 2nd-floor landing. I went up the fire escape myself, because the interior stairs weren't survivable by then, and I found that family in a back bedroom, the mother with a wet towel pressed against the door crack, doing everything right that she'd probably never been taught to do, just instinct and desperate love keeping her children alive 1 more minute at a time. I got all 4 of them out through a window onto that fire escape, one at a time, the youngest first, and by the time I got the mother out last, the room behind us had flashed over completely. 6 more seconds, maybe less, and none of us would have made it back down. I didn't tell Ryan about that night for almost 20 years. He was born the following year, 1995, and by the time he was old enough to understand a story like that, I'd already fallen into the habit, the mistake, I understand now, of keeping the job separate from home, believing that a house needed to be a refuge from the things I saw, not another place where those things lived. I thought I was protecting my family by staying quiet about the worst of it. What I didn't understand, not until Ryan screamed that sentence at me in his hallway 3 weeks ago, was that the silence didn't just protect them from the fires. It also hid the reasons why I kept walking back into them, again and again, for 38 years, even after nights like the one on Alberta Street left me lying awake for months afterward. Even after 2 separate injuries that any reasonable man would have used as an excuse to take a desk assignment and never looked back. Margaret, my wife of 41 years before she passed in 2019, understood the silence better than I ever gave her credit for, and I think, looking back, she paid a cost for it that I never fully reckoned with while she was alive to hear me say so. She used to tell me in the kitchen late at night after I'd come home from a bad call and gone quiet in the particular way she'd learned to recognize over the decades, that she wished I'd let her carry some of it with me, instead of carrying all of it alone and calling that protection. "You're not protecting us, Tom," she told me once, maybe 15 years into the marriage. "You're just making sure we love a stranger instead of a whole man." I didn't understand what she meant at the time. I understand it now, sitting in my truck 3 weeks ago in Ryan's driveway, turning her words over for the first time in years, wishing more than almost anything that she'd been alive to see the ballroom, to hear Gerald Okafor and Marisol Vega and David Whitfield say out loud the things I'd never learned how to say myself, and to watch our son's face finally understand what she'd been trying to tell me for 4 decades. I retired at the end of last year, 38 years to the month, the mandatory ceremony that the department holds for every captain who reaches that kind of tenure. I hadn't wanted a big one. I'd told the union rep as much. Keep it small, a few colleagues, nothing that made a fuss. But the department does things a certain way when a career runs that long, and the ceremony had been on the calendar for months, scheduled for a Saturday morning at the Grand Ballroom downtown, regardless of what I personally wanted. Ryan and Sarah were invited, of course, along with the rest of our small extended family, and I honestly didn't know, after that Tuesday night in his hallway, whether he'd come at all. He came. I want you to know that up front, because I think it matters for what happened next. He came, I believe now, mostly out of a sense of obligation rather than any real desire to be there, and he sat near the back of that ballroom with Sarah beside him, arms crossed, the posture of a man attending something he'd rather not be attending. What he didn't know, what I hadn't told him, because I genuinely hadn't known the full scope of it myself until I walked into that ballroom, was that word had gone out through the department and the broader regional firefighting community about the ceremony, and firefighters had traveled from departments across 3 counties, some retired, some still active, some who'd transferred to other cities decades earlier, and driven back specifically for that Saturday morning. By the time the ceremony started, there were, by the fire marshal's own rough count, right around 200 firefighters in that ballroom, most of them in dress uniform, filling nearly every seat and lining the walls 3 deep in the back. I watched Ryan's face change over the course of that ceremony, and I want to walk you through it, because I think it's the most important part of this whole story. Before I get to that, let me tell you what the room itself looked like, because I think the scale of it matters. 200 firefighters, most in dress blues, gold buttons catching the light from the chandeliers overhead, rows of chairs filling the ballroom floor, and men and women standing 3 deep along the back wall and down both sides because the seating had run out an hour before the ceremony even started. There were faces in that room I hadn't seen in 20 years. Guys I'd trained back in the early 90s who'd gone on to departments in Seattle and Sacramento, and one who'd flown in from Phoenix specifically for that Saturday morning. I recognized retired Chief Donaldson, who'd been a rookie under me in 1991 and gone on to run the whole bureau himself for 6 years before his own retirement. I saw women I'd mentored back when very few women were being brought into the department at all, several of whom now held command positions themselves. The sheer number of people who had rearranged a Saturday, some of them driving hours, just to stand in a room for a ceremony honoring a captain they hadn't worked alongside in years, was not something I had expected, and I confess it undid me a little before the ceremony had even properly begun. It started with the chief's opening remarks, which included, almost as an aside, a reference to the Alberta Street Rescue, and I saw Ryan's head turn slightly, unfamiliar with the phrase. Then came the retired captain who'd served alongside me at Station 21 in the 90s, a man named Gerald Okafor, who stood up and told the full story of that March night in 1994. The 4-story building, the mother and 3 children, the 6 seconds between the rescue and the flashover that would have taken all of us. Gerald has a way of telling a story that makes a room go completely silent, and he didn't spare any of the details. The heat coming through that fire escape railing hot enough to blister a bare hand, the sound the building made right before the flashover, a sound Gerald described as the whole structure taking one last breath before it let go. I watched my son's face go pale, watched Sarah's hand find his on the armrest between them, watched him turn slowly in his seat to look back at me sitting near the front. And I have never, in 74 years of living, seen an expression quite like the one that crossed my son's face in that moment. The visible, physical process of a man's entire understanding of his father rearranging itself in real time. But Alberta Street wasn't the only story that got told that morning, and I think it's important you understand that, because I don't want you to think this was a single heroic moment inflating a whole career into something it wasn't. A retired lieutenant named Marisol Vega spoke about a warehouse fire in 2003 where I'd gone back in for a rookie firefighter who'd gotten disoriented in heavy smoke, guiding him out by voice and touch after his radio failed, at real risk to my own life, because leaving no one behind wasn't a slogan to me, it was the only version of the job I ever knew how to do. A current battalion chief named David Whitfield, who'd been a 19-year-old probationary firefighter under my supervision in 2009, stood up and told the room that I'd personally pulled him back by his coat collar during a partial roof collapse that would have killed him if he'd been standing 2 feet further to the left, and that he'd named his own son after me, a detail I confess I hadn't fully known until that morning, and one that undid me almost as much as it undid Ryan. By the time the department presented me with the Chief's Award for Distinguished Service, the highest departmental honor available, given to fewer than a dozen firefighters in the Bureau's history, every single person in that room stood, all 200 of them, and the applause went on long enough that I had to look at the floor for a while, because a man doesn't always know what to do with that kind of sound directed at him. I found Ryan afterward, near the coffee table at the back of the ballroom, standing alone while Sarah spoke with some of the other firefighters' families. He looked, for the first time since he was a small boy, genuinely uncertain of himself. "Dad," he said, and stopped, and started again. "I didn't know any of that. 29 years old and I didn't know one single thing you just heard in there. Why didn't you ever tell me?" I told him the truth, the same truth I'm telling you now. I told him I thought silence was a kind of protection, that I believed, wrongly, that a father who talked too much about the fires was a father who brought the fires home with him. I told him that every missed game, every missed recital, every night I came home too exhausted and too haunted to be the father I wanted to be at the dinner table, had a face and a name behind it that I never let him see. Alberta Street's mother and her 3 children, the rookie in the warehouse, David Whitfield on that collapsing roof, and that I understood now, only now, after 200 firefighters had said out loud what I never could, that hiding those faces from my own son hadn't protected him from anything. It had only left him alone with the absence, with no way to understand what the absence was actually for. "You said I was never anyone important," I told him, and I watched him flinch at his own words repeated back to him. "I understand why you believe that. I gave you every reason to believe it, because I never once, in 29 years, sat you down and told you what those nights actually cost me, or what they were actually for. That's on me, Ryan, not on you." He put his arms around me right there by the coffee table, in front of 200 firefighters he'd never met, and he held on longer than he had in years, and he told me he was sorry, and I told him I was sorry too. Sorry for a different reason than he probably expected. Sorry not for the nights I'd spent at the station, which I couldn't undo, and wouldn't have undone even if I could, but for the 38 years of silence afterward, that had let my own son grow up believing his father's absence meant his father didn't care, instead of understanding that it meant almost the opposite. Things have been different between us since that Saturday. Not perfect. I don't think any real relationship gets fixed in a single ballroom, no matter how many people are standing in it, but different in a way that matters. Ryan calls me now and asks questions he never used to ask, about the job, about specific calls, about what it actually felt like standing at the bottom of that fire escape on Alberta Street, deciding whether the roof would hold long enough to make one more trip. I've started telling him, slowly, carefully, in pieces he can actually hold on to rather than all at once. But I've started, and I think that alone has done more for the two of us than any apology either of us could have offered on its own. He asked me, a few weeks ago, whether I regretted any of it. The missed games, the missed years, the version of fatherhood that the job took from both of us. I told him the honest answer, which is more complicated than a simple yes or no. I regret the silence. I regret believing that not talking about the fires was the same thing as protecting my family from them. But I don't regret walking up that fire escape in 1994, or back into that warehouse in 2003, or reaching for David Whitfield's collar in 2009, because those choices are also, in their own way, the reason Ryan has a father sitting across from him today at 74 years old, instead of a folded flag and a name on a memorial wall. I told him that being the kind of man who runs toward the fire and being the kind of father who's present at the dinner table shouldn't have to be opposites. That I think, if I'd been braver about talking instead of just about running into burning buildings, I could have found a way to be both. That's the real lesson I want him to carry forward, more than any ballroom full of applause. Sarah had the baby 6 weeks after the ceremony. A girl, Margaret Louise, named after her grandmother. A decision Ryan and Sarah told me they'd made together the week before her birth. And I will confess to you that when Ryan called to tell me the name they'd chosen, I had to sit down on my own kitchen floor for a few minutes before I could trust my voice enough to call him back. I've held that little girl more times in the 2 months since than I think I held Ryan in his entire first year combined, and I don't say that with pride. I say it as an honest accounting of a debt I'm trying, in whatever years I have left, to pay down as best I can. Ryan brought her by my house last Sunday, and I sat on the porch with her asleep against my chest, and I told her, quietly, the way you tell things to a baby who can't understand the words yet but who might somehow still absorb the feeling underneath them, about Alberta Street, about the warehouse, about her great-grandmother Margaret who never got to meet her but who would have loved her fiercely. Ryan stood in the doorway listening, and neither of us said anything about it afterward, but I think we both understood that something had shifted permanently in how this family tells its own story to the people who come after us. If you're watching this and you're the child of someone whose work took them away from you more than you ever understood at the time, a first responder, a nurse, a soldier, anyone whose absence had a reason you were never given the full shape of, I'd ask you to consider asking them about it. Really asking and really listening to the answer before you decide what their absence meant. And if you're a parent carrying silence the way I carried mine for 38 years, believing that protecting your children means keeping the hardest parts of your life invisible to them, I'd ask you to reconsider that too. My son needed 200 firefighters standing in a ballroom to learn what I could have told him myself, in pieces, over 38 years of dinner tables. Don't wait as long as I did. Let me know in the comments where you're watching this from tonight, and if there's someone in your own life whose sacrifices you didn't fully understand until much later than you wish you had. And if this story meant something to you, stay a while. I've got more to tell.